Welcome back to our 8th session of Strategies for Success, EY Insights into Key Trends. And certainly last but not least, we look into one of the trends that we've been talking about actually before as well, which is sustainability. And I'm joined by two experts here, Jeroen, Jonathan, thanks for making time, pleasure to have you. Maybe, diving right into it. It's been a long day for many of the people online as well. So when we say sustainability regulations, that's been a driver for change, of course, but what are you actually doing with clients day in, day out?
Yeah, that's a good question to start with. So if you look at the world, and yesterday and the day before, we saw significant changes already with the Trump administration coming in with new tariffs. So you see that there's a lot of supply chain changes, but there's also a lot of sustainability-related changes. So you have companies that already made their net zero targets, they have the KPI settings, but you also have a lot of regulatory developments. And you can think about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, European deforestation rules, plastic packaging tax, extended producer responsibilities. So what we're doing as a team is literally three things. So we do impact assessments, we do fit gap assessments, and eventually we help companies with the design of their data platform. So it's really the functional design, the technical elements. So for instance, on the impact assessments, so we're scanning the regulations, we look at the company, at the footprint, look at how they're being impacted, and then see from a financial, but also from a compliance perspective, what that means for them. On the fit gap, we look at, hey, what should be your target operating model, and what is your current capabilities, and we look at the gaps. And those go again along those regulations, whereby we try to be also pragmatic and say, hey, look, here, you need to actually make sure that you have more data components, you need to reach out to your suppliers. How do you do that? And that brings you also to the overarching point, and that is, hey, in a world where there's a request for more and more data points within all those regulatory developments, hey, how do you do that? And there we help from an ESG data platform perspective. And Jonathan, maybe you can explain a little bit more what we really do there.
Yeah. So basically, if you're talking about functional design and how do you become compliant with certain regulations, I would say the starting point is what is already there. Like, what are the existing processes and systems available at the client? And a good example is always how do you communicate with your suppliers? As an example, if you're using SAP Ariba, you may also be able to use it to get different data elements that you've not been requesting before through your standard platform supplier outreach. That one also really helps you to tackle these new regulations. And what we typically also see is once we really look at the existing processes, at the existing systems, that there's a lot of synergies between certain regulations and processes. So typically a lot of the work is really getting people into a room, getting a better overview, really understanding the business model of a client. And that's also why we are here together. I'm more of the trade person within sustainability. You're more the operating model person. And typically, you need to have a bit of both to tackle these regulations.
That makes perfect sense, yeah. So maybe we start on, this side of the big pond, looking into the EU and, all of the ambitions there that we have to reduce some of the red tape there. Omnibus simplification packages, maybe the keyword here. And Jonathan, you already mentioned data. So how is the whole story impacting the adaptation of an integrated data platform? And what do we see here with the Omnibus simplification package?
Yeah, so if it comes to Omnibus, that's really the simplification of all these sustainability-related regulations in the EU, except for EU deforestation regulations, which very intentionally wasn't touched by Omnibus. But if you're looking at CSDDD, CSRD, yesterday there was the big vote in the EU Parliament where they really passed the stop the clock. So companies will have about 2 years more time, bit of different timeline for small, medium-sized companies. But what we typically recommend is there's a lot of no-regret actions. And if it comes to really establishing these data platforms, a lot of it is no regret and should continue. And that's also what we heard. We did a big webcast recently. I think it was a record-breaking participation from our clients for the Omnibus webcast. And we asked the question, what is now going on is it pens down because you have more time. I think it was almost 70% that said, no, we will continue with sustainability reporting, but also getting ready for CSDDD, so the due diligence directive. So there's a lot of similarities. I don't know how you see it, Jeroen, but I feel like really companies are continuing, and there's a lot of these like no regret actions that companies should do anyway.
Yeah, and if you look also, and I'm linking it back to, let's say, the other side of the pond. Obviously, Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and if you look at those measures that we still want to implement in Europe, we're talking about especially reduction of carbon emissions, the footprint, but you need to have that supply chain visibility. So if you look at the omnibus proposals, it tries to reduce the reporting obligations. And on CBAM, for instance, we still want to target actually the most significant polluters by having a CBAM regulation. But someone that is having a minimal impact and a small footprint, do they need to have the same reporting obligation? So, and I think that's why omnibus is welcome from multiple perspectives. If you look at more the supply chain related elements, and that's, for instance, European deforestation rules, but also the new digital product passport, also within the CSDDD, those elements are looking at, hey, how can we at least first have visibility of the supply chain, and then also target those reductions. And my philosophy is those supply chain transparency rules within the sustainability field, those will remain there. I literally see actually 5 components there that's coming together. So you have increased regulatory scrutiny. So if I take the European deforestation rule, according to the rules, every single authority needs to at least assess, depending on the risk level, 9, 6 or 3% of the shipments. Within Germany alone, according to some of the figures, there are 300,000 operators. So you need to have some data, you need to be prepared, and that means that eventually you will be checked, you will be monitored, because there's this regulatory requirement. Then on the data collection, so if we look at PPT or we look at extended producer responsibility, those are popping up in different countries. So we have the UK, with Spain, Italy is postponing, but we will expect eventually that other countries will adopt like similar legislation. There's probably quite a lot of overlap in the data points that you need. So once you start actually looking for those data points, whether it is for PPT in the UK versus Spain, less overlap, but the one in Italy towards Spain, there's a lot of overlap. So you get those data collection points, which are so important, and that is not only within the legislation, but is also on like the horizontal level. And then with that, you have, of course, IT running cost, right? So you cannot, my example of 300,000 operators in Germany, you need to have data, you need to have technology. So you can have a patchwork of solutions and have a tool for CSRD, can have a tool for CSDDD, one for EUDR. And in the end of the day, because you have all those things being siloed, well, there is some commonality in the data points, you're going to have higher running cost. So we already see there that some of the companies are pivoting towards more an integrated end-to-end data strategy for the sustainability points. And also, if you look at the 4th point, you have the different rules and regulations where are trying to get a little bit together. So for EUDR, we need to have the traceability throughout tier N. So it's really the external supply chain, you need to have that visibility. Now, if you look at the digital product passport legislation that is coming, same thing. So it starts to come together. So when you start targeting one of the legislation, you already should have like actually the connecting points in mind. And then obviously, and that is also why Omnibus is welcoming, but at the same time, based on the philosophy that those sustainability-related supply chain legislations will stay there, there's an increased cost of compliance. So eventually that means that you need to find a way to target that. And for me, there are only 2 answers there. That is centralized. You need to have a centralized team. You need to develop that control, that framework, so you do not reach out 20 times to the same supplier, and even worse, 20 times to the same supplier by different legal entities in the group. And you need to have a data-driven approach.
That makes perfect sense. Really interesting as well. So now maybe one step back, because you said we're performing these impact assessments, yeah? And you're seeing many clients every week, and you perform quite some of these assessments as well. So what are you seeing? Is there like any pattern? What's the market observations really?
It really depends per industry.
Okay.
So we have a couple of industries or client-specific setups where the impact is minimal, right? It's more costly to comply. And for instance, the PPT rules, so the plastic packaging rules, it's more a nightmare from a compliance perspective than that it's really the cost element.
Yep.
However, we did it for a consumer product company. We started to look at all the legislations together, and we used there our like value accelerator tool, and you quantify based on the current legislation, but also you start already to look at, hey, is there extension coming? So for instance, for CBAM, they said like, hey, we're going to review the commodities in scope. We know that for EUDR, that will happen the same. If we assume that certain plastic packaging rules, like Italy, they will start adopting them, and you start also to put the externalities in there, you will see that some companies that are running on an annual cost 150 million a year, and they are not aware of it. So it's almost that you drive fully into a roadblock without knowing it, because 150 million a year, first of all, that's a lot of cost, but it also means that you need to have that data, you need to respond, you need to reach out towards your customers, towards your suppliers, and on top of that, you need to organize that. So if you do that in a firefighting mode, I think you're getting behind towards your competitors. So there's an element there that you can, hey, look, if I have 150 million cost a year, maybe I really need to look at my sourcing strategy. I need to look at where do I have my warehouses? Where do I actually get my customers? Where are they getting? So what's the center of gravity? And so you can also optimize your supply chain and also think about reduction of cost and reduction, of course, of carbon emissions. There's like one more thing. It's not only, I think, the negative thing. There's also the carrot. And there's a lot of incentives out there. So Draghi came with this proposal, with this report, the whatever it takes, right? And he said, we need to, as Europe, we need to be ready. There needs to be a new competitive environment. And you saw 2 weeks ago European Commission's response. Within the pages, and there are a lot of new acts coming, AI, there's like everything what we talk about, there's a new act from a European perspective. But throughout every single line, they say that needs to be subsidized in the form of incentives. And we already see that with the European Green Deal, there's a lot of incentives available. And even within Switzerland, with the Climate and Innovation Act, which is going to be effective as of the 1st of June of this year, it's already effective for the 1st of January, but you can start to obtain funding per June. You will see that the transition towards like carbon capture systems or other like carbon neutral initiatives can be funded by like public money.
Makes sense. Maybe we look into the second thing that you're doing, the fit gap assessments. And if you look at one regulation kind of isolated usually or multiple and try to bring it all together, how do you run your fit gaps?
Yeah, so as Jeroen already mentioned, quite often the data points are the same. And you made a great example with plastic packaging tax, because a lot of the information is also required for extended producer responsibility, especially if it comes to packaging. So what we typically do, and this is very like industry specific, also depending on the footprint of a client, we really map out all the regulations that could be of relevance, sometimes on a regional level, but it can also make sense to really look at it from a global level, because we even saw similarities between Europe, Africa, and the US if it comes to packaging-related legislation. So by really mapping out all the relevant legislations that are now applicable, but also doing a bit of a horizon screening and showing what comes next. We really help the client to identify where they are and what is missing. And these like fit gap workshops, fit gap assessments, however you want to call them, they're really helpful to then build a roadmap. And while at the same time, also a lot of companies are still looking into their S/4HANA journey, especially if they're SAP-based, that can also be helpful, because typically when you start to like migrate your system, you also want to know what's next? Is this going to be just like covering my current requirements, or is this going to be something that is sustainable for the coming years? So I think there we can really add value, and I also personally, I like it to look into new regulations and see whether there's certain synergies.
Perfect. Maybe let's look into data, because we started and kind of kicked it off with the data and the platforms, and I know that's usually a pretty hot topic. So if you look at the design of an ESG data platform, and let's say you have a bit more traditional data management maybe in place, so how do you approach it? And could you give maybe an example as well regarding the deforestation one, or anything that comes to mind?
Yeah. So you know that within EY we have big alliances. So we have one big alliance with Microsoft and another big alliance with SAP. And if I go back to Jonathan's point about, hey, there's like a data component that you need, you also look at automatization. Right. So those regulations are often rule-based. There's a lot of, and also with your background, what I already mentioned, customs data. So the triggering moments are, for instance, hey, what is your customs code? When are you the importer of record? When you're the exporter of record. So that determines what kind of liability you have as an organization. So you can build that logic into a data platform. So, and that's what we're doing with, for instance, both alliances, where we look at all those regulations. And that goes not only about CBAM, EPR, PPT, EUDR, but it goes also about the reporting elements that are partially being targeted by Omnibus. So what we do, we're building those triggering moments. And those triggering moments need to be always bespoke, because every single company has a different transactional model, they have different processes. So we build that logic into a data platform to automate as much as possible. So at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you have a supplier outreach. Based on the answers from the suppliers, there's a risk assessment. Then based on the scoring, you have a risk mitigation questions or data that you ask, all trying to be automated as much as possible. And then eventually, if you get the green light, you get into a situation whereby you need to submit a due diligence. So that's going into the European data platform. So that's all being built into systems, and that gives you the end-to-end ESG data platform.
Right. So does every client then need this ESG data platform approach, or other options as well?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I would say single source of truth is a really important one, because the worst thing that can happen to you is that someone's asking you a question, either an internal stakeholder or a government authority, and you tell them, look, the answer depends on which system I'm asking. So that's why we typically see that the companies that are most affected, and we see that for a lot of sustainability-related regulations, it's either the heavy polluting industries or it's consumer. Right. And especially in the consumer industry, we see that there's a certain trend to these platform solutions. So it's no longer this best of breed. I'm getting a tool for a very specific regulation, but I want this all to be really with a native integration. Separately set up, of course, because each regulation is still different output, different input. But the single source of truth and really migrating to a platform, plus in addition, and I think you made a really good point, it's also in the long term, it's cheaper to maintain it, because each separate solution that you're connecting, for example, as an API into your overall landscape, you will still have to maintain that interface.
No, I agree with you. I think there's maybe, you're not starting to shoot with a bazooka on a little mosquito, right? So there will be small players where you better can do, because the impact is just simply not there for them. But for the bigger multinationals, the organizations with tens and thousands of employees worldwide, they will be targeted by whether it's an EUDR, whether it's an CBAM or other kind of regulations. And with also not only Europe starting to introduce those measures, but we see that also in Africa and even in APAC. US a little bit less lately, but with those rules and regulations, I think those bigger companies have no other choice than eventually to look at an ESG data platform approach.
Right. Thanks a lot for the insights. We do actually have 2 questions from the audience, right? And we start with maybe the less political one and a bit more general, which is, when we talk about tax and sustainability, what is it actually? How would you define it?
That's a good one. So for me, if you look at how the European Union is drafting the regulation, they're looking at triggering points. And those triggering points are often connected to the way you actually have set up your operating and your tax model. So if you decided that you operated like a full-blown principal model, which is like, let's say, a European HQ or a global HQ out of Switzerland, you have certain design parameters there in the model. You retain ownership on the inventory as long as possible, which also means that you may actually result that you're becoming the importer of record. So that is a design principle within the operating/tax model. Now, if you take those regulations, CBAM, EUDR, they link it back to being the importer of record. So the triggering moment is there. So whatever you're trying to do, and for instance, one of the solutions in order to mitigate some of the pain points is, hey, make sure that you're not the importer of record. And that's what some companies are doing, and we're helping them with that as well. And looking for like, hey, if your supplier already has an operations in Europe, let them be the importer. But there are knock-on effects, which directly goes back also to the model that you design principles from a tax perspective. So I think to answer the question twofold, one is, hey, those triggering events, and the second, hey, if you change something, it will have a tax consequence.
That makes perfect sense. Now, to the other one, it's probably not directly sustainability linked, but yesterday there was a bigger geopolitical event. We are facing some new tariffs coming from the US. So what are your thoughts around that, if you want to have a take at it?
You want to go first, Jonathan?
I can go first. And I was actually like watching the press conference that President Trump gave in the Rose Garden. My wife was asking me, why are you so interested in this? And I said, like, first of all, I have a background as a global trade consultant, so new tariffs, that's always exciting for me. But it's much more. It's really also, it becomes a geopolitical tool. And there I also see that a lot of the sustainability-related regulation could be affected in it. Whether Omnibus was really a response to the geopolitical changes, I'm not sure. I think to a certain degree it's also just like really focused on simplifications, reducing administrative burdens within the EU. But I really see that this new geopolitical environment and the US that really wants to like negotiate better deals, this may also impact regulations like carbon border adjustment mechanism, where you could have a credible like argument on WTO level to say it is a tariff. We would say it's just like leveling the playing field between producers in the EU, outside the EU, but it comes across as a tariff because, as Jeroen said, the triggering event is the import. So there are certain aspects also, if we come to the EU deforestation regulation, it could be conceived as a like non-tariff barrier for foreign goods, which would also impact, as an example, goods produced in the US. So certainly something to watch out for. And I think next year we might talk about tariffs instead of sustainability.
Definitely interesting, Jeroen. What's your point of view on the event yesterday?
Now you definitely see that probably tariffs or like EUDR, CBAM are probably closer than VAT towards like retaliation measures. I think Europe decided, and even though that we saw, of course, a little bit of change in the political spectrum in Europe, but they decided that, hey, we want to stay with the Paris Agreement. And this is already where we started this discussion. If you want to stay with the Paris Agreement, you need to have measures in place. So a customer demand change will not per se change behavior. A net zero strategy is actually coming from, for instance, the Paris Agreement. Regulations, it's really, it's the carrot or the stick, right? It's the incentives or you have regulations, and those are the drivers for change. So I'm pretty convinced that with at least the European mindset, that people are in favor of measures, and that needs to be proportionate, right? So those need to be proportionate, and Omnibus is a good reason for like having a critical look at them. But I truly think that those measures will stay, in one way or the other. So if that's the assumption, and we think that that's the best thing to do also for like the planet, then I think that Europe will probably respond differently than taking away, let's say, those sustainability-related measures. Now, you can do two things, right? You can accept that you've been targeted. You can take a step back, and yesterday on LinkedIn I saw someone saying the Swiss approach, take a Rivella and think about it and then do nothing. And maybe that's the smartest idea, because the moment that you start retaliating, and we saw today with, of course, China saying, hey, we got slammed with, I think, 34%, and we will put like 34% like actually measures again against the US imports, it will be a tic-tac. So if Europe, and I'm talking about Europe, if they are smart, they will think about, hey, what do we want to change in order to be competitive? What do we want as a dot on the horizon? And instead of responding to it in a direct way, probably you get into retaliation measures that are differently. And Japan did that. They started to look at, hey, there's the treasury bonds, what are we going to do with it? And that is a whole different kind of response than putting tariffs on oil. And that may actually result in also the legislation as we discussed today to stay here.
Yeah. Really good. Thank you. Just looking at time, I'm sure we could probably continue the conversation for a while, and we can actually afterwards once we're offline here. But before we close the session, thanks very much to everyone who's been joining online. Hope you enjoyed the day, or at least some of the sessions, if you couldn't make it to all of them. We will make sure that you get a follow-up email reasonably soon. You will get all the slides that we've been showing, of course. And then in a few days and weeks from here, you'll also see all of the recordings online, so you can watch on demand on YouTube, and you'll also get that message, of course. Thanks very much indeed for joining again. Stay tuned for next year as well. Should be an interesting event next year. I heard there's some changes upcoming, so you should better watch out for that one as well. And with that, we're going to close it. Thanks a lot again. Enjoy the evening and hope to hear from you soon.